For more on this, I'm joined here on set by advisor to the Turkish president, Saadet Oruç. Thank you for joining us on the program. I'd like to ask you now, we've got Recep Tayyip Erdogan coming here to Paris. Of course, one of the main issues is improved ties with the European Union.
Yes.
How would he like to go about doing this?
First of all, it's the first visit of the year 2018, and there are too many positive messages from both Turkish president and French president also. And we should talk about here the recent messages by the Turkish foreign minister when he said, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, he said that we would like to improve our relations with Germany also, because relations with Germany was a problem for the last year. And this year, we are open to the improvement of our relations, but of course there are some responsibilities of the EU. And our side also, we have responsibilities. And, of course, opening of the new chapters is very important. But there are other issues also, refugee issue, visa issue for two sides. We need each other, Turkey and the European Union. And here, France plays an important role, key role, a constructive role, a positive role for the future of the short-term future of the relations between Turkey and the European Union.
Well, indeed, there are a number of issues that both leaders don't agree upon. One of the things that we heard Emmanuel Macron say he would mention, he would discuss with his Turkish counterpart, of course, is the issue of jailed journalists. And
Yes.
we did have the spokesperson for President Erdogan say that Emmanuel Macron's comments concerning jailed journalists lacked information. What does this mean?
Yes. First of all, we have to understand the situation in Turkey. We passed through a period after 15th of July, after 15th of July, the coup attempt. We are passing through a very critical period, and here I was a journalist also. I started to work as a journalist in the year 1995, and still I'm writing for some newspapers also. And I think that a journalist should be aware of her limits and responsibilities also. You are not without you don't have an immunity. So you have to understand the limits of your journalism. For example, the journalists who are imprisoned, they are not imprisoned because of their journalistic activities. There are other things also. So, and we should understand the role functioning of justice in Turkey also. And before all, I think the blockade in the minds of our European friends, it needs to be lifted, because there is a blockade concerning Turkey. And when you start to talk about Turkey, journalists, human rights, but we are a
I understand you're saying
law and democracy also, and we passed through a very important period. Just imagine, Assemblée Nationale will be bombed by jets, and people will be killed in the streets.
One thing I think perhaps, and it's interesting you mentioned the mentality and understanding this perhaps blockade, but it's perhaps the scale of the crackdown that we have seen in wake of the failed coup attempt. And you mentioned the judicial system, saying that not all journalists that have been jailed are simply because of the work that they're doing, but many are being detained without any charges. Now, that's something that perhaps then makes it hard to say that it's simply on judicial matters.
For example, in the French interview also, I gave an example. Perhaps it will be a repetition, but there are two procedures in France also. One was about the attacks on French operations in Libya, and the other, another declassified information that François Hollande, ex-president, he talked to Le Monde reporters, and there are procedures for this also. For example, when we talk about Cumhuriyet case, it made a headline of trucks loaded with weapons to Daesh, a fabricated story this. And it was a premier etape which carried out the which tried to prepare the Turkish public opinion for the coup attempt. It was a a psychological tool for preparation of the coup attempt. So we cannot talk about this as a journalistic activity. It's not a journalistic activity. It's just a preparation of the public opinion for this. And for other journalists also, there are too many ways to defend themselves. Of course, the time of their imprisonment and the length of their imprisoned period, it's not something good. So we have to perhaps function the institutions in a faster way. You can criticize this, that they are seeing a judge after months of detention. That can be criticized, but the others, you should just lift your, if you will.
But for the moment, we've seen just a deterioration in terms of the situation. The country, Turkey, continues to slide in the press freedom index, going down. We've seen now for 2 straight years. As you were saying that you yourself were a journalist, how do you describe the actions then that the government is taking against opposition media?
In French, a French journalist, because I worked in France for 11 years, and now I follow France very closely. I follow our colleagues also very closely. In France, a French journalist, can he not criticize, attack the principles of the country, like laïcism, security? Just think about the psychology after Charlie Hebdo attacks. Just think about the psychology after Bataclan attacks. So just think about the atmosphere.
But
you
were allowed to criticize the government following those attacks. You were allowed to criticize.
It's not criticism. We are talking about some attacks by media. So we should make a distinction between the journalistic activity and the military.
I'd like to ask you a bit then about, once again, the impact of this crackdown, both on the domestic front and internationally. In the recent referendum held this April, we saw many of Turkey's relatively urban areas, including Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, as well as the Kurdish region in the southeast, largely vote against, saying no, but against the presidency, really saying to change the constitution and to increase presidential powers.
How do you see this over?
Yes, please.
Please continue.
Okay, no, so my question is, then given this crackdown, do you actually think that it's counterproductive, and that in the long run, because we have seen President Erdogan actually was more popular in these areas, do you see that support eroding because of this crackdown?
If I'm not misunderstood,
I'm talking strictly of the referendum, talking about figures from the referendum.
But you know, the result of the referendum was for the
overall it was yes,
presidential government system.
Indeed, but when you look, I'm talking about specific urban areas, large pockets then of communities where the president enjoyed popularity. We actually saw a no in Ankara province. It was a no, 51%. We saw in Izmir province it was a no with 68.8%. Same thing in Antalya province, 59%. So my question is, do you see that actually his popularity is decreasing because of this, and that it's actually counterproductive?
I mean, if you have a prejudice that there is a crackdown, first of all, there isn't a crackdown. There is a judicial procedure, and Turkey,
we have tens of thousands of people who have been detained, who have been taken away.
Because there were tens of thousands of people who had links with the terrorist organization, and they infiltrated into intelligence organization.
And what is the process?
Into the intelligence organization, security organization, between the politicians also. And there are measures within the constitution, framework of the Turkish constitution, and our obligations in the international arena also. We are just taking the responsibility for this, but we are passing through a procedure for prosecuting the attempts for that coup attempt. I think you are minimizing. The problem is that you are minimizing the threat that Turkey was faced to. And there is justice. If someone is not guilty, if there is no crime, he's able to defend himself. So, I mean, again, I'm talking about the blockade in minds. When we talk about human rights, press freedom, I'm a journalist also, and I'm for civil rights also. I'm not someone in a military mind or something, but just you are talking about the threat that a country was faced to, and it was not only an attempt for a coup, it was also an attempt for an invasion also.
Just briefly, because unfortunately we are running out of time, I'd like to ask you then, you touched upon it a bit before, about the EU-Turkey deal that we saw that was signed in 2016. Of course, this is something that's been criticized by rights groups. This deal does aim to stem the flow of migrants that we've seen entering the European Union. What is your take on this? Where do we see this moving forward?
I mean, first of all, there is the responsibility of the EU side. I'm not talking about the responsibility of France. The European Union institutions, they gave too many, they promised a lot, but they did nothing. So we are just waiting them to fulfill their obligations, promises. But we are also, I think, last summer, I'm sure that you consulted with the figures of immigrants just passing to the Aegean coast to Greece. The number has decreased a lot, so we should underline this.
All right. Well, we are going to have to leave it there, but I do appreciate you joining us here.
It's a pleasure also. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.